The crystal chandelier above our table cast dancing shadows across the white tablecloth as Bartholomew raised his champagne flute, his wedding ring catching the amber light. 30 years of marriage, and I could still remember the weight of that same ring sliding onto his finger during our wedding ceremony, back when his hands were smoother and his smile reached his eyes more easily. Tonight, on our pearl anniversary, something felt different in the way he held himself, the way his gaze seemed to skate past mine rather than meeting it directly. To us, he said, his voice carrying that familiar authoritative tone that had once made me feel protected, but now sounded more like a command. 30 years of partnership. The pause before partnership hung in the air like a question mark. I lifted my own glass, studying his face in the flickering candlelight. Bartholomew Ashworth, at 53, still carried himself with the confidence of a man who'd never doubted his place in the world. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly styled, his charcoal suit impeccable, his posture straight as the day I'd met him at the law firm where we both worked fresh out of university. But there was something in his brown eyes tonight that I couldn't quite identify, something that made my stomach flutter with an unease I couldn't name. To partnership, I echoed, though the word felt strange on my tongue. We touched glasses with the delicate chime of expensive crystal, and I took a small sip of the champagne he'd ordered without consulting me. Dom Perignon, of course. Bartholomew had always had expensive tastes, a trait that had seemed sophisticated when we were young and ambitious, climbing the ladder at Pemberton and Associates together. Now, it sometimes felt like a weight around our necks, this constant need to maintain appearances, to live up to the image we'd constructed of successful professional couple. The restaurant buzzed with quiet conversation around us, the kind of upscale establishment where voices never rose above cultured murmurs, and the waitstaff moved like ghosts between tables draped in pristine linen. Le Bernardin had been our place once, where we'd celebrated promotions and anniversaries, where Bartholomew had proposed on my 28th birthday with a 2-carat diamond that had seemed like the answer to every dream I'd ever had. Tonight, the familiar surroundings felt somehow foreign, as if I were seeing them through different eyes. "Serafina," Bartholomew said, setting down his glass with deliberate precision, "we need to talk about some things." My full name. Not Sarah, not darling, not any of the pet names that had peppered our conversation for 3 decades. The formality of it sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the restaurant's air conditioning. I set my own glass down carefully, my hands suddenly unsteady. "What kind of things?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light, conversational. Around us, other couples continued their intimate dinners, celebrating their own milestones, unaware that at table 17 something was beginning to crack. Bartholomew straightened his tie, a nervous habit I'd noticed increasing over the past few months. "I've been doing some thinking about our future, about what we both want from this marriage going forward." The word marriage sounded clinical coming from his lips, like a business contract up for renegotiation rather than the sacred bond we'd promised to honor before God and our families 30 years ago. I thought about that young woman in the flowing white dress, how she'd believed with absolute certainty that love would be enough to carry them through anything life could throw their way. How naive she seemed now, sitting across from this stranger who wore my husband's face but spoke in the language of corporate restructuring. I see, I said, though I didn't see it all. And what conclusions have you reached? He leaned back in his chair, assuming the position I'd seen him take countless times during difficult negotiations with opposing counsel. The detached professional, weighing options and calculating outcomes. Never had I imagined he'd turn that calculating gaze on our marriage, on me. The truth is, Serafina, we've grown apart. We want different things now. We're different people than we were when we got married. I felt something cold settle in my chest, spreading outward like frost on a window. Different how? You've become... He paused, searching for words with the same care he'd used to craft a legal brief. Complacent, set in your ways. You've lost the ambition that first attracted me to you. The drive to excel, to achieve something meaningful. The words hit me like physical blows. Complacent, set in my ways. I thought about the past 5 years, how I'd gradually stepped back from the demanding pace of corporate law to focus more on our home, our relationship, how I'd turned down partnership tracks and high-profile cases to be more present for the marriage I'd thought we were both invested in building. Apparently, those sacrifices had been noticed, but not in the way I'd hoped. I've been trying to create a stable foundation for us, I said quietly. A real home, not just a showcase for our professional success. Bartholomew's laugh was sharp, brittle. A foundation? Serafina, you've been playing house while the world moved on without you. When was the last time you brought in a significant client? When was the last time you did anything that wasn't related to interior decorating or planning dinner parties for my colleagues? Each question felt like a scalpel, precisely placed to cause maximum damage. I thought about the dinner parties I'd hosted, carefully orchestrated events designed to advance his career, to build the network of relationships that had helped him secure his current position as senior partner. Apparently, my contributions to his success had been forgotten, filed away like outdated legal precedents. Those dinner parties helped build your practice, I said, my voice gaining strength. My connections brought you the Whitmore account, the Pemberton merger. I've been your partner in every sense of the word. That was years ago, he dismissed with a wave of his hand. What have you done for me lately? For us lately? You've become deadweight, Serafina. A beautiful, expensive ornament that serves no practical purpose anymore. The cruelty of it took my breath away. Dead weight, ornament. These were the words he used to describe the woman who'd shared his bed for 30 years, who'd supported his ambitions even when they conflicted with her own dreams, who'd molded herself into whatever shape he needed her to be at any given moment. I felt tears threatening and blinked them back, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing me break down in public. I see, I said again, though my voice sounded strange to my own ears, distant and hollow. So what exactly are you proposing? Bartholomew leaned forward, his brown eyes now bright with something that looked almost like excitement, the expression of a man about to close a deal that heavily favored his side. I want a separation, a clean break while we're both still young enough to start over. You can keep the furniture, the jewelry, your personal belongings. I'll be generous with the settlement. Don't worry about that. But I want you out of the house by tomorrow evening. The words hung in the air between us like smoke from a fire that had been burning longer than I'd realized. Tomorrow evening. As if 30 years of marriage could be dismantled in 24 hours, packed away like seasonal decorations no longer needed. Just like that? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. You've decided our marriage is over, and I have one day to pack up my life and leave? I've put up with you for 30 years, Bartholomew said, his voice rising slightly before he caught himself and glanced around the restaurant. Other diners were beginning to look in our direction, drawn by the tension radiating from our table. He lowered his voice again, but the words carried just as much venom. I'm done, Serafina. I've done my time. I deserve better than this, better than you. Done his time. As if our marriage had been a prison sentence he'd endured rather than a choice he'd made freely, repeatedly, every day for 3 decades. I stared at this man I'd loved since I was 23 years old, searching for any trace of the person who'd once promised to cherish me in sickness and in health, for better or worse. All I saw was a stranger wearing Bartholomew's face, speaking words that seemed designed to cause maximum pain. And where exactly am I supposed to go on such short notice? I asked, my practical mind beginning to function despite the emotional chaos swirling through me. That's not my problem anymore, he said with a shrug that spoke of years of resentment carefully hidden beneath a veneer of marital civility. You're a grown woman with a law degree. Figure it out. I thought about our house on Maple Street, the Tudor-style home with its leaded glass windows and carefully tended garden where I'd spent countless hours nurturing roses and planning improvements. The house where we had hosted Christmas dinners and anniversary parties, where I'd dreamed of grandchildren playing in the backyard someday. The house that had been my sanctuary, my project, my pride for the past 15 years. The house, I said slowly, testing the words. You're keeping the house. Of course I'm keeping the house, Bartholomew replied, as if the question itself was absurd. It's in my name. I make the mortgage payments. It's my house. It's always been my house. You just live there. Just lived there, as if I hadn't spent 15 years turning that house into a home, as if I hadn't researched every renovation, supervised every contractor, chosen every piece of furniture with careful consideration for both form and function, as if the countless hours I'd invested in creating a space that reflected both our tastes and aspirations meant nothing at all. But there was something in the certainty of his statement that struck me as odd. The house had been purchased during our marriage with money from both our careers. In our state, that made it marital property, regardless of whose name appeared on the deed. Unless there was something I didn't know, some detail he'd never shared with me. The deed? I said carefully. When did you put the house solely in your name? Bartholomew's expression flickered, just for a moment, but I caught it. The brief uncertainty, the slight tightening around his eyes that told me he wasn't as confident about his legal position as he'd tried to sound. The details don't matter, he said quickly. The point is, the house is mine. You need to accept that and move on. But the details did matter, especially to someone with 3 decades of legal training. Community property laws, marital assets, the complex web of financial entanglements that came with a long marriage where both parties had contributed to major purchases. I found myself thinking like a lawyer for the first time in months, analyzing the situation with the sharp focus that had once made me formidable in contract negotiations. I think I'd like to see those details, I said, my voice growing steadier. The deed, the mortgage documents, the purchase agreement. just to make sure we're both clear on the legal realities here. Bartholomew's jaw tightened, and I saw a flash of something that might have been panic cross his features before he regained control. Serafina, don't make this more difficult than it needs to be. I'm trying to be civilized about this, but if you force me to involve lawyers, I am a lawyer, I reminded him, and I know my rights. The waiter appeared at our table with perfect timing, his face carefully neutral as he inquired about our entrees. Bartholomew ordered the filet mignon without consulting me, just as he'd ordered the champagne. I asked for the salmon, though my appetite had completely disappeared. Food seemed irrelevant when your entire life was crumbling around you like a house of cards in a strong wind. After the waiter left, we sat in silence for several minutes. I watched my husband's face, noting the muscle that twitched in his jaw when he was agitated, the way his fingers drummed against the table in a rhythm I'd once found endearing. Now these familiar gestures seemed like tells in a poker game, revealing more than he intended. "There's someone else," I said finally. It wasn't a question. Bartholomew's drumming fingers stilled. This isn't about anyone else. This is about us, about what we've become. That's not an answer. He sighed, the sound heavy with exaggerated patience. Her name is Vivian. She's an associate at the firm. 28 years old, brilliant legal mind, full of the kind of ambition you used to have. 28. The same age I'd been when he proposed to me in this very restaurant. The symmetry was either coincidental or deliberately cruel. Knowing Bartholomew, it was probably the latter. He'd always had a flair for dramatic gestures, for moments calculated to achieve maximum impact. "How long?" I asked. "Does it matter?" "It matters to me." Another sigh, this one tinged with annoyance at my persistence. 8 months, maybe 9. She understands what I need from a partner, professionally and personally. She challenges me, pushes me to be better instead of just accepting mediocrity. Mediocrity. Another blade, expertly wielded. I thought about the woman I'd been at 28, hungry and driven and absolutely certain that love could conquer any obstacle. Now I wondered if Vivian knew what she was signing up for, if she understood that Bartholomew's definition of partnership was strictly hierarchical, with himself permanently installed at the top. "And you think she'll be different? That in 25 years she won't become complacent and set in her ways too?" Bartholomew's smile was sharp, predatory. "She's not going to let herself become what you became, Serafina. She has too much self-respect for that." The implication was clear. I'd let myself go, had failed to maintain the standards he expected from a wife. Never mind that those standards had shifted over the years, moving target that they were. Never mind that every time I'd tried to adapt, to become what he seemed to want, the goalpost moved again. Our entrees arrived, and we ate in tense silence. The salmon was perfectly prepared, but it could have been cardboard for all I tasted. My mind was racing, calculating assets and liabilities, trying to remember details about the house purchase that had seemed unimportant at the time. We'd been married for 15 years when we bought the Maple Street house, using proceeds from the sale of our previous home, plus substantial savings from both our careers. I remembered signing documents, remembered the excitement of finally having enough space for the life we'd planned together. But I also remembered something else, a conversation we'd had with our real estate attorney about how to hold title. Bartholomew had been very specific about certain aspects of the purchase, insisting on structures that he'd said would provide tax advantages and estate planning benefits. At the time, I'd trusted his judgment completely. He was, after all, the one with more experience in real estate law. Now I wondered if there had been other motivations behind those decisions. "I'll need time to find a place," I said finally, breaking the silence that had stretched between us like a chasm. "One day," Bartholomew replied firmly. "I've already made arrangements to have the locks changed tomorrow evening. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." The coldness of it stunned me. He'd already planned the lock change, had probably already given a key to 28-year-old Vivian. This wasn't a spontaneous decision born from a moment of marital frustration. This was a calculated move, executed with the same precision he brought to hostile corporate takeovers. What about our things, our shared possessions? "Take what's personal to you. Everything else stays with the house." Everything else. The antique dining set we'd purchased together in Vermont, the art collection we'd built over 20 years of travel and shared discoveries, the library of legal texts and first edition novels we'd accumulated through decades of birthdays and anniversaries. All of it would remain with him in the house he claimed to own with the woman who had replaced me. I thought about the pearl necklace he'd given me for our 25th anniversary, sitting in the jewelry box upstairs in what I'd thought of as our bedroom. The irony wasn't lost on me that we were celebrating our pearl anniversary on the night he was discarding me like an outdated piece of jewelry that no longer suited his current style. "The children should know," I said, thinking of our daughter Evangeline in Chicago and our son Maximilian in Seattle. Both adults now, both building their own lives, but they deserved to understand what was happening to the family they'd grown up believing was unshakable. "I'll handle the children," Bartholomew said dismissively. "This doesn't need to become some dramatic family crisis. They're adults. They'll understand that sometimes marriages run their course. They'll understand that their father abandoned their mother for a woman younger than they are." His eyes flashed with anger, the first genuine emotion I'd seen from him all evening. "I'm not abandoning anyone. I'm making a mature decision about the direction of my life. If you can't see the difference, that just proves how out of touch you've become." Out of touch, another small cruelty, another way of dismissing 30 years of shared history as if it had been a mistake from the beginning. I wondered when he'd started seeing me as the enemy rather than his partner, when the woman he'd once loved enough to marry had become someone he couldn't wait to discard. The waiter returned to clear our plates, asking about dessert with professional optimism. Bartholomew declined for both of us, signaling for the check with an authority that encompassed me as if I were simply another piece of property he controlled. The gesture was small, but it crystallized something for me about the dynamic that had developed between us over the years. When had I stopped having a voice in even the smallest decisions? "I have some questions about the house," I said as we waited for the check. "Legal questions that will need to be resolved before I can agree to anything." Bartholomew's expression hardened. "There's nothing to resolve. The house is mine. End of discussion." But I was remembering more now, details that had seemed unimportant at the time, but were taking on new significance. The house had been purchased with money from multiple sources, including a significant inheritance I'd received from my grandmother's estate just months before we'd made the offer. That inheritance had provided nearly half the down payment, money that had definitely been mine alone before marriage. More importantly, I was remembering the conversation with our attorney about title and ownership. Bartholomew had been very insistent about certain aspects of how the deed would be structured, but I was beginning to recall that the final documents might not have been exactly what he'd described to me tonight. "I think you might be mistaken about the ownership structure," I said carefully. "I'd like to review the actual deed before I make any decisions about moving out." "The deed is irrelevant," Bartholomew snapped, his composure finally cracking. "I've made my decision, and you need to respect it. This marriage is over, Serafina. Accept it with some dignity." Dignity, as if there was anything dignified about being discarded in a public restaurant on your anniversary, told to pack up 30 years of marriage in 24 hours and disappear from the life you'd helped build. As if dignity was something he had any right to lecture me about after blindsiding me with his betrayal. But there was something in his insistence about the deed being irrelevant that struck me as significant. Why would the legal ownership of the house be irrelevant unless he knew something I didn't, or unless he was hoping I wouldn't look too closely at the actual documents? The check arrived, and Bartholomew paid it with his credit card, the same platinum card that had funded our life together for the past decade. I wondered if Vivian knew about the debt we'd accumulated, the careful balancing act that kept our lavish lifestyle afloat on a foundation of credit and appearances. The house itself carried a substantial mortgage despite our years of payments, refinanced twice to fund renovations and maintain the image of success that Bartholomew seemed to require. "I'll drop you at home," he said as we stood to leave. "I'm staying at the Marriott tonight. To give you space to pack and process all of this." Home. He still called it home, even as he was evicting me from it. The word carried a bitter taste now, representing not sanctuary, but exile, not belonging, but displacement. As we walked through the restaurant toward the exit, I caught glimpses of other couples bent over intimate conversations, sharing desserts and anniversary toasts, celebrating milestones in marriages that seemed more solid than ours had ever been. I wondered if any of them could imagine how quickly it could all disappear, how 30 years of shared history could be erased in a single conversation over expensive wine and perfectly prepared fish. The drive home was silent except for the soft jazz playing on the radio, the same station we'd listened to for years during our evening commutes. Bartholomew drove with his usual confidence, navigating familiar streets toward the house where I'd planned to grow old with him. Now those plans seemed as naive as fairy tales, childish fantasies that had no place in the harsh reality of modern marriage. When we pulled into the driveway, I saw the house with new eyes, the Tudor Revival architecture that had seemed so sophisticated 15 years ago, the carefully maintained landscaping that had been my pride and joy, the warm light glowing from the windows we'd chosen together during the renovation. It all looked different now, like a stage set for a play that was ending before the final act. "Serafina," Bartholomew said as I opened the car door, "I know this is difficult, but it's for the best, for both of us. You'll see that eventually." I turned to look at him one last time. This man, who'd been the center of my world for 3 decades. His face was shadowed in the dim light from the dashboard, but I could see the relief in his expression. Relief that the difficult conversation was over, that the unpleasant business of ending our marriage had been handled with what he probably considered efficiency and tact. "I'll see you tomorrow evening," he said, "to make sure the transition goes smoothly." Transition. As if I were being transferred to a different department rather than exiled from the only life I'd known for 30 years, I nodded without speaking and walked toward the front door, fishing for my keys with hands that had started to shake again. Inside the house, silence enveloped me like a suffocating blanket. Every room held memories that now felt like accusations. The living room where we'd hosted countless dinner parties. The kitchen where I'd prepared anniversary meals for a man who was apparently counting down the days until he could escape. The bedroom where we'd shared what I'd thought was intimacy, but what might have been mere proximity. I walked through the rooms slowly, seeing them as if for the first time, or perhaps for the last time. "Tomorrow evening," Bartholomew had said, "less than 24 hours to pack up a life and find somewhere else to live." The urgency of it was almost laughable if it weren't so cruel. But as I climbed the stairs toward our bedroom, my mind was working with the clarity that had served me well in my legal career. Something about Bartholomew's insistence on the house ownership didn't add up. His nervousness when I'd asked about the deed, his dismissal of my questions as irrelevant, his absolute certainty about his legal position, despite the complex realities of marital property law. In the bedroom, I opened the filing cabinet where we kept important documents, tax returns, insurance policies, investment statements, and near the back, the folder containing our real estate documents. My hands were steady now as I pulled out the deed to the house, the document that would either confirm Bartholomew's authority to evict me or reveal that his confidence was misplaced. As I spread the deed across our bed and began to read, I felt something shift inside me. Not the crushing despair I'd expected, but something sharper, more focused. Something that felt almost like hope, though I didn't dare name it yet. The legal language was dense, but I understood every word. And what I understood changed everything about my situation, everything about tomorrow's deadline, everything about who held the real power in this divorce that Bartholomew thought he could orchestrate on his terms. I read the document twice, then 3 times, making sure I hadn't misunderstood anything, but the facts were clear, laid out in careful legal terminology that left no room for misinterpretation. Bartholomew had made a critical error in his calculations, and tomorrow evening, when he arrived expecting to find me packed and gone, he was going to discover just how costly that error would prove to be. I sat on the edge of our bed, the deed spread before me like evidence in a case that could determine my entire future. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 11 times, each tone echoing through the house with a finality that seemed appropriate for this night of endings and revelations. My mind raced through the implications of what I'd discovered, calculating possibilities and outcomes with the precision that had once made me one of the most sought-after contract attorneys in the city. Bartholomew thought he held all the cards, believed he'd cornered me into accepting his terms for ending our marriage. He'd strutted through that restaurant like a man who'd already won the game, dealing out ultimatums and deadlines with the confidence of someone who'd done his homework. But apparently, his homework had been incomplete. I thought about calling Evangeline or Maximilian, my children who'd grown up believing their parents had built something lasting together. How would I explain that their father had discarded me like an outdated business plan? How could I help them understand that the marriage they'd witnessed for their entire lives had apparently been a facade hiding Bartholomew's growing resentment and dissatisfaction? Not tonight, I decided. Tonight belonged to me, to processing this information and planning my response. My children deserve better than a midnight phone call filled with tears and confusion. They deserve to hear the whole story once I understood it myself. I folded the deed carefully and placed it back in the filing cabinet, but not before making a mental note of every critical detail. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but they would be challenges I was prepared to meet. Bartholomew had given me until tomorrow evening, assuming I'd spend those precious hours in panic and desperation, scrambling to find somewhere to go and someone to take me in. Instead, I would spend them preparing for a confrontation he wasn't expecting. The house felt different now as I moved through it, turning off lights and securing doors for what I'd thought might be my last night here. Every room held new meaning, every possession a different weight. This wasn't just the home I'd shared with my husband. It was the foundation of my future, the asset that would determine whether I emerged from this divorce as a victim or as a woman who'd fought for what was rightfully hers. In the bathroom, I removed my pearl earrings and the matching necklace Bartholomew had given me for our 25th anniversary. The jewelry felt heavier tonight, weighted with symbolism I hadn't recognized before. Pearls, formed through irritation and pressure, created when something unwelcome invaded the oyster's peaceful existence. Perhaps they were more appropriate for this anniversary than either of us had realized. As I prepared for bed in the room I'd shared with Bartholomew for 15 years, I allowed myself to think about Vivian for the first time since he'd mentioned her name. 28 years old, brilliant, ambitious, full of the drive he claimed I'd lost somewhere along the way. I wondered if she knew about tonight's conversation, if she was waiting somewhere for his call, confirming that the obstacle to their future happiness had been efficiently removed. Tomorrow, I thought as I turned off the bedside lamp, she would learn that obstacles sometimes have more substance than anticipated, and Bartholomew would discover that the woman he'd dismissed as complacent and defeated still possessed all the skills that had once made her a formidable opponent in any legal arena. The last thing I heard before sleep claimed me was the grandfather clock chiming midnight, marking the beginning of what would prove to be the most important day of my adult life. I woke at 6:30, earlier than usual, my internal clock apparently attuned to the magnitude of what lay ahead. The morning light filtered through the bedroom curtains, casting familiar patterns across the hardwood floor that I'd walked across thousands of times. Today, those patterns looked different somehow, as if the very foundation of my reality had shifted during the night. Bartholomew's side of the bed remained undisturbed, the crisp hotel sheets at the Marriott probably more welcoming than the marital bed where he'd delivered his devastating ultimatum. I wondered if he'd slept well, secure in his certainty that by evening he'd have successfully excised me from his life with surgical precision. The thought carried a bitter satisfaction that surprised me with its intensity. After showering and dressing in one of my favorite suits, a navy blue ensemble that had always made me feel competent and authoritative, I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with the morning paper. The routine felt surreal under the circumstances, as if I were an actress playing the role of a woman whose world hadn't exploded less than 12 hours earlier. but there was something comforting about the familiar rituals, the small acts of normalcy that anchored me while my mind raced ahead to the confrontation that awaited. At 8 o'clock, I called my office and informed my assistant, Margaret, that I wouldn't be in today due to a family emergency. It wasn't entirely a lie. The dissolution of a 30-year marriage certainly qualified as an emergency, even if the family in question consisted of only two increasingly hostile parties. "Is there anything I can help with?" Margaret asked, her voice warm with genuine concern. She'd been with the firm almost as long as I had witnessed the evolution of my marriage from the early days when Bartholomew would surprise me with lunch deliveries to the recent years when he rarely acknowledged my existence in professional settings. "Actually, yes," I said, making a decision that felt both impulsive and inevitable. "Could you pull the file on the Henderson property dispute from 2 years ago, the one involving joint ownership claims after divorce? I'd like to review the precedents we established in that case." If Margaret found the request odd, given my personal circumstances, she was too professional to comment. "I'll have it ready for you whenever you need it." After ending the call, I spent the morning methodically going through our financial records, creating a comprehensive picture of assets and liabilities that painted a very different story than the one Bartholomew had presented last night. Our joint checking account, the investment portfolio we'd built together, the retirement funds accumulated through decades of dual careers, all of it represented marital property that couldn't be dismissed with a wave of his hand and a demand that I disappear. But it was the house that remained the centerpiece of my strategy, the foundation upon which everything else would be built or destroyed. I pulled the deed from the filing cabinet again, spreading it across the dining room table where we'd shared thousands of meals and hundreds of conversations about our future together. The irony wasn't lost on me that this document, which I'd barely glanced at during the excitement of our home purchase 15 years ago, would now determine the terms of our separation. The legal language was precise and unambiguous once you understood how to read it. The property at 412 Maple Street had been purchased jointly, with funds from both parties contributing to the down payment. But, more significantly, the deed had been structured as a tenancy by the entirety, a form of ownership available only to married couples that provided certain legal protections. Under this arrangement, neither spouse could unilaterally transfer or encumber their interest in the property without the explicit consent of the other. More importantly, for my current situation, neither spouse could be forced to leave the property or relinquish their ownership rights simply because the other party demanded it. Bartholomew could no more evict me from this house than I could evict him. The revelation should have brought relief, but instead I felt a growing anger that surprised me with its intensity. He'd known. Of course he'd known. As a real estate attorney with 25 years of experience, Bartholomew understood property law better than most judges. His demand that I leave by evening wasn't based on legal authority. It was based on his assumption that I wouldn't challenge him, that I'd accept his version of reality without question. It was a calculated gamble that I would be too devastated, too overwhelmed, too intimidated by his certainty to examine the actual facts. He'd counted on my emotional state to override my professional training, expecting grief and panic to cloud my judgment long enough for him to establish new living arrangements with Vivian. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 10 times, each note reverberating through the house with deliberate precision. I had 8 hours until Bartholomew's deadline, 8 hours before he arrived expecting to find me gone and the locks already changed. Instead, he would find me very much in residence, armed with legal documentation and a clarity of purpose that had been building since I'd first read that deed. I spent the afternoon calling attorneys, not to hire representation, but to verify my understanding of tenancy by the entirety laws in our state. Every conversation confirmed what I already knew. Bartholomew had no legal authority to force me from the house, regardless of his threats about lock changes and deadlines. His confidence was built on deception. His ultimatum, nothing more than an elaborate bluff designed to achieve through intimidation what he couldn't accomplish through law. By 4 o'clock, I'd compiled a comprehensive file of legal precedents, financial records, and property documents that painted an irrefutable picture of my rights and his obligations. The woman who'd sat shell-shocked in that restaurant last night, absorbing insults and ultimatums without protest, had been replaced by the attorney who'd once negotiated million-dollar contracts and outmaneuvered opposing counsel in cases far more complex than a straightforward property dispute. I arranged the documents on the dining room table with courtroom precision, each piece of evidence positioned for maximum impact. The deed occupied the center position, flanked by financial statements and legal precedents that supported my position. It looked like preparation for a trial, which in many ways it was. At 5:30, I heard Bartholomew's car in the driveway, the familiar sound of his BMW pulling up to the house he'd tried to claim as exclusively his. Through the front window, I watched him climb the steps with the confidence of a man who believed he held all the advantages. He carried a small toolbox, probably containing new locks and deadbolts intended to physically enforce his fictional authority. When he rang the doorbell, I let him wait, not long enough to be petty, but long enough to establish that I was operating on my own timeline now, not his. When I finally opened the door, his expression shifted from surprise to irritation to something that might have been apprehension. "Serafina," he said, his voice carrying the forced patience of someone explaining simple concepts to a child, "I thought we agreed you'd be gone by now. This is making things unnecessarily difficult." "We didn't agree to anything," I replied, stepping back to let him enter. "You issued an ultimatum based on assumptions that turned out to be incorrect." He set the toolbox down in the foyer with more force than necessary, the sound echoing through the house like a gavel, marking the beginning of proceedings. My assumptions about what, exactly? Instead of answering immediately, I led him toward the dining room where my documentation waited. His eyes swept across the carefully arranged papers, and I saw the moment he realized this wouldn't be the simple eviction he'd orchestrated. The confident stride faltered slightly, replaced by the cautious movements of someone navigating unfamiliar territory. "I spent the day reviewing our property arrangements," I said, settling into the chair at the head of the table, a position that felt both natural and strategic. "I thought you might be interested in what I discovered." Bartholomew remained standing, his posture rigid with the kind of tension that came from sensing a trap without being able to identify its precise nature. "Serafina, whatever you think you found, it doesn't change the fundamental situation. This marriage is over, and you need to accept that reality." "Oh, I accept that our marriage is over," I said, my voice steady and clear. "What I don't accept is your version of what that means legally and financially." I picked up the deed and held it where he could see it, watching his face for any sign of recognition or concern. What I saw was more telling than any confession: the slight tightening around his eyes, the almost imperceptible shift in his stance that spoke of someone whose carefully constructed narrative was beginning to unravel. "The house," I continued, "is held as tenancy by the entirety. I'm sure you remember that designation, since you were the one who insisted on it when we structured the purchase." Bartholomew's jaw tightened, and for the first time since he'd delivered his ultimatum last night, he looked genuinely uncomfortable. The specific legal structure doesn't matter in a divorce situation. Assets will be divided according to court determination. "But we're not in court yet, are we?" I asked, allowing a small smile to touch my lips. "And until we are, this house belongs to both of us equally. Neither party can unilaterally exclude the other, regardless of personal preferences or new romantic arrangements." The mention of Vivian hit its mark. Bartholomew's composure cracked just enough to reveal the anger simmering beneath his controlled exterior. "You're being deliberately obtuse. I've explained the situation to you clearly. Fighting me on this will only make things more expensive and unpleasant for everyone involved." "More expensive for whom?" I asked, pulling out the financial statements I'd compiled. "Because according to these records, you're already carrying significant debt. The credit cards, the home equity line, the lifestyle expenses that exceed our actual income. How exactly are you planning to afford a protracted legal battle while also maintaining two households?" This was new territory for our relationship. In 30 years of marriage, I'd never challenged Bartholomew's financial decisions or questioned his authority over our monetary affairs. I'd trusted him to manage our resources responsibly, to make decisions that benefited both of us, rather than simply serving his immediate desires. Now, seeing the numbers laid out in stark black and white, I realized that trust had been misplaced. Our apparently comfortable lifestyle was built on a foundation of borrowed money and deferred payments, a house of cards that couldn't withstand the financial strain of divorce proceedings. "Those numbers are taken out of context," Bartholomew said, but his voice lacked its usual authority. "You don't understand the complexity of our financial situation." "I understand that you've been living beyond our means for years," I replied. "I understand that the mortgage on this house has been refinanced twice to cover other expenses. I understand that your savings account contains less than $5,000, hardly enough to fund a new life with your ambitious young associate." Each fact hit like a physical blow, stripping away the illusion of financial security that had surrounded our marriage. Bartholomew had presented himself as the successful provider, the breadwinner whose resources would allow him to dictate terms for our separation. In reality, he was a man drowning in debt who'd gambled everything on my willingness to disappear quietly. "Vivian doesn't know about our financial situation, does she?" I asked, the pieces of his deception falling into place. "She thinks she's getting involved with a successful senior partner who can provide the lifestyle she expects. What happens when she discovers the truth?" Bartholomew's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "My relationship with Vivian is none of your concern. What matters is resolving our situation in a way that allows both of us to move forward. I agree completely, I said, leaning back in my chair with the confidence of someone holding winning cards, which is why I've prepared a proposal for how we might proceed. I pulled out a manila folder I'd prepared, containing documents that represented hours of careful calculation and legal research. Bartholomew eyed it warily, like a defendant watching a prosecutor produce evidence he hadn't expected to exist. My proposal is quite simple, I continued. We list the house for sale immediately and split the proceeds after paying off the remaining mortgage and home equity debt. We divide our other assets equally, including retirement accounts and investment portfolios. You assume responsibility for the credit card debt since it was accumulated primarily for your personal expenses, and we each retain our own vehicles and personal belongings. It was a fair proposal, more generous than many divorce settlements I'd seen during my career. Under other circumstances, it might have formed the basis for an amicable separation between two people who'd simply grown apart over time. But these weren't other circumstances, and Bartholomew's reaction made it clear that fairness wasn't his primary objective. Absolutely not, he said, his voice rising slightly before he caught himself and glanced toward the windows. The house stays off the market. I'm not selling my home to satisfy your vindictive demands. Your home? I asked, raising an eyebrow. I thought we'd established that it's our home, legally and financially, unless you're planning to buy out my 50% interest? The silence that followed was deafening. We both knew he couldn't afford to buy out my share, just as we both knew he couldn't force me to sell against my will. The legal and financial realities created a stalemate that could only be resolved through negotiation or prolonged litigation. "What do you really want, Serafina?" Bartholomew asked finally, his voice heavy with the exhaustion of someone whose carefully laid plans had begun to unravel. "What will it take for you to be reasonable about this?" Reasonable. The word carried implications that made my teeth clench. Reasonable meant accepting his definition of reality, accommodating his preferences, sacrificing my interests for his convenience. It meant being the same compliant wife who'd spent 30 years making his life easier at the expense of her own dreams and ambitions. "I want exactly what I proposed," I said firmly, "a fair division of assets and debts, followed by a clean break that allows both of us to start over. What I don't want is to be manipulated, intimidated, or dismissed as if my contributions to this marriage were worthless." Bartholomew ran a hand through his salt and pepper hair, a gesture I'd seen countless times during difficult negotiations, but this time he was the one at a disadvantage, the one scrambling to find solid ground in shifting legal territory. "The children," he said suddenly, as if remembering a tactical advantage he'd overlooked. "Evangeline and Maximilian need stability during this transition. Forcing a house sale would disrupt the family home they've known since childhood." It was a low blow, using our children's emotional well-being as leverage in a dispute he'd created. Both Evangeline and Maximilian were adults with their own homes and careers, but the house on Maple Street remained the center of their family identity, the place where holidays and celebrations had been held for 15 years. The children deserved to know the truth about why their family home is being disrupted, I replied. They deserve to understand that their father chose to end this marriage for another woman, rather than hearing some sanitized version about growing apart or mutual differences. The threat was implicit but clear. Bartholomew had been counting on controlling the narrative of our divorce, presenting himself as the reasonable party forced to make difficult decisions by an unreasonable wife. If our children learned the full story, his carefully constructed image would suffer damage that extended beyond our immediate family to his professional and social circles. "You wouldn't?" he said, but uncertainty flickered in his eyes. "I wouldn't what? Tell our children the truth? Honor them with honesty instead of protecting your reputation at their expense?" I leaned forward, meeting his gaze directly. "Bartholomew, I've spent 30 years protecting your image, smoothing over your mistakes, making excuses for your behavior. That arrangement ended last night in the restaurant." The grandfather clock chimed 7 times, marking another hour in this strange new reality where we faced each other as adversaries rather than spouses. I thought about all the evenings we'd spent in this house, discussing cases and clients, planning vacations and renovations, building what I'd believed was a partnership based on mutual respect and shared goals. Now I wondered how many of those conversations had been genuine, how often Bartholomew had simply been going through the motions while planning his eventual escape. The man sitting across from me seemed like a stranger, wearing my husband's face, speaking words that bore no resemblance to the vows we'd exchanged 30 years earlier. "I need time to think about your proposal," he said finally. The admission of uncertainty, a significant shift from the confident ultimatums of the previous evening. "Of course," I replied graciously, "but you should know that my offer has an expiration date. If we can't reach an agreement within 30 days, I'll file for divorce and let the court determine asset division. Given our financial situation and the circumstances of the marital breakdown, I suspect the outcome would be significantly less favorable to your interests." The threat wasn't empty. In our state, adultery remained grounds for fault-based divorce, and Bartholomew's relationship with Vivian provided clear evidence of marital misconduct. Combined with his attempts to exclude me from marital property and his deceptive financial practices, a court would likely view his behavior unfavorably when determining asset division and spousal support. 30 days, he repeated, as if testing the weight of the deadline. 30 days, I confirmed. "And Bartholomew? If you change the locks on this house or attempt to exclude me from the property in any way, I'll file an emergency motion for contempt and seek immediate court intervention. I trust that won't be necessary." He gathered his toolbox without a word, the new locks apparently no longer needed. At the front door, he paused as if wanting to say something that might salvage some dignity from the evening's proceedings. Instead, he simply nodded curtly and walked to his car. I watched from the window as he drove away, his taillights disappearing into the gathering dusk. The house felt different now, no longer a shared space where we navigated the careful choreography of long marriage, but my sanctuary, my fortress, my foundation for whatever came next. The following weeks passed in a strange, suspended animation. Bartholomew maintained his residence at the Marriott while we both pretended to maintain normal routines at the law firm. Our colleagues undoubtedly sensed the tension between us, but professional courtesy prevented direct questions about our obviously strained relationship. Vivian, I noticed, seemed increasingly uncomfortable whenever our paths crossed in the office corridors. The confident young associate who'd captured Bartholomew's attention now appeared uncertain, perhaps beginning to understand that workplace romances came with complications she hadn't anticipated. I wondered if Bartholomew had shared any details about our ongoing negotiations, or if she remained blissfully unaware of the financial and legal obstacles standing between her and the future she'd imagined. On a Thursday morning, 3 weeks into our strange standoff, Margaret knocked on my office door with an expression that suggested news of some significance. "Mrs. Ashworth," she said, using the formal address that had become standard during this period of professional uncertainty. "Your husband would like to schedule a meeting to discuss your proposal. He suggested Saturday afternoon at the house." The timing was interesting. Saturday would provide privacy for a conversation that was likely to be emotionally charged, away from the professional environment where we'd both been maintaining facades of normalcy. It also suggested that Bartholomew had spent considerable time weighing his options and finding them limited. "Saturday at 2 o'clock, that would be acceptable," I replied. "Please confirm with him that I'll expect written documentation of any counterproposal he wishes to present." Margaret nodded and withdrew, leaving me to contemplate what this meeting might bring. 3 weeks of reflection had apparently convinced Bartholomew that his initial strategy was unsustainable, but I doubted he would simply accept my terms without attempting some form of negotiation. Saturday arrived with the crisp clarity of early autumn, the kind of day that had once been perfect for leisurely mornings with coffee and newspapers, for planning weekend projects and enjoying the comfortable rhythms of long marriage. Now it felt like the calm before a storm, the final quiet moments before a battle that would determine the shape of both our futures. Bartholomew arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, carrying a leather briefcase that suggested he'd taken my demand for documentation seriously. He looked tired, older somehow, as if the stress of maintaining 2 separate lives was beginning to exact its toll. For a moment, I felt a flicker of the old sympathy that had once made me want to smooth his troubles and support his ambitions. Then I remembered his words from that anniversary dinner, the casual cruelty with which he'd dismissed 30 years of marriage and partnership. The sympathy faded, replaced by the clear-eyed determination that had sustained me through these weeks of uncertainty. "Serafina," he said, settling into the chair across from me at the dining room table where this confrontation had begun, "I've given considerable thought to your proposal, and I believe we can reach a mutually acceptable agreement." He opened his briefcase and withdrew a folder thick with legal documents, spreading them across the table with the precision of someone presenting a complex case to a jury. I recognized the format immediately, a formal settlement agreement, complete with exhibits and supporting documentation. "I'm prepared to accept the basic framework of your proposal," he continued, "with some modifications that I believe address both our interests more effectively." I picked up the first document, scanning the legal language with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd reviewed countless contracts during her career. The basic structure was indeed similar to what I'd proposed: equal division of assets, assumption of debt responsibility, provision for selling the house, and splitting proceeds. But as I read more carefully, I began to notice subtle modifications that would shift the balance significantly in Bartholomew's favor. The timeline for selling the house was extended to 18 months, allowing him to continue living there while making minimal mortgage payments. The division of retirement assets was structured to give him larger immediate distributions while leaving me with accounts that wouldn't mature for several years. Most significantly, the debt assumption clause had been modified to make me responsible for a substantial portion of obligations I'd never incurred. "These modifications are not acceptable," I said, setting the documents aside without finishing my review. "They fundamentally alter the fairness of the original proposal." Bartholomew's expression hardened, the reasonable negotiator mask slipping to reveal the frustrated man beneath. "You're being unrealistic about the complexities involved. These adjustments reflect practical considerations that your initial proposal ignored. They reflect your desire to maintain your current lifestyle at my expense," I corrected. "You want to continue living in the house while I absorb the costs of establishing a new residence. You want immediate access to retirement funds while leaving me with illiquid assets. You want me to assume responsibility for debts I didn't create while you start fresh with Vivian." Each point hit its mark, stripping away the veneer of legal reasonableness to expose the self-serving calculations beneath. Bartholomew's proposal wasn't a negotiation. It was an attempt to achieve through complex legal language what he couldn't accomplish through direct intimidation. "I've made significant concessions," he said, his voice rising slightly. "I'm offering you far more than you'd receive in a contested divorce." "Are you?" I asked, pulling out my own folder of documentation. "Because I've done some research on recent divorce settlements involving adultery and financial misconduct. The outcomes are quite favorable to the innocent party, particularly when that party can demonstrate significant financial contributions to marital assets." I spread my own documents across the table: legal precedents, financial analyses, expert opinions on asset valuation that painted a very different picture than the one Bartholomew's proposal suggested. Under the stark realities of contested divorce proceedings, I would likely receive well over 50% of marital assets, plus substantial spousal support, plus attorney fees. Furthermore, I continued, I've discovered some interesting details about the credit card debt you want me to assume. The charges include substantial expenses for gifts, travel, and entertainment that appear to be connected to your relationship with Vivian. I'm confident a judge would find those to be separate debts for which you bear sole responsibility. Bartholomew's face had gone pale as the implications of my research became clear. He'd gambled that I would accept his terms rather than face the uncertainty and expense of litigation. Instead, I'd armed myself with the kind of comprehensive legal strategy that could devastate his financial position and professional reputation. "What do you want?" he asked finally, the question carrying a tone of genuine defeat. I looked at this man who'd shared my life for 30 years, who'd been my partner in building careers and raising children, who'd now become my adversary in a battle neither of us had anticipated when we'd exchanged vows as young, optimistic attorneys full of plans and dreams. "I want my original proposal accepted in full," I said quietly. "No modifications, no delays, no attempts to shift financial responsibility to me for your poor decisions. We sell the house, divide the proceeds fairly, and both start over with clean slates. And if I refuse, then we go to court, and you explain to a judge why you tried to evict your wife from her own home to make room for your 28-year-old girlfriend. You explain the credit card charges for romantic getaways with someone other than your spouse. You explain why you thought you could intimidate me into accepting less than my legal entitlement. The silence that followed stretched between us like a chasm, filled with the weight of 30 years of shared history, now reduced to legal documents and financial calculations. Outside, I could hear the distant sound of neighbors working in their yards, living their normal Saturday lives, while mine was being fundamentally restructured. The children will know everything, Bartholomew said finally, about Vivian, about the affair, about all of it. The children deserve the truth, I replied. They're adults. They can handle reality better than they can handle lies and manipulation. He gathered his documents slowly. The settlement proposal that had represented his best hope for controlling our divorce, now worthless in the face of my superior preparation. As he closed his briefcase, I saw something in his expression that might have been respect, or perhaps simply acknowledgement that he'd underestimated the woman he'd lived with for 3 decades. "I'll have my attorney prepare acceptance documents," he said, standing to leave. "It should be finalized within the week." At the front door, he paused one final time. "For what it's worth, Serafina, I never intended for things to end this way." I studied his face, searching for any sign of the man I'd fallen in love with 30 years earlier. "How did you intend for them to end, Bartholomew? With me gratefully accepting exile while you started over with someone younger? With our children believing their mother simply gave up on the family they'd known all their lives?" He had no answer, perhaps because there was no answer that would make his behavior seem reasonable or justified. He'd made choices that served his immediate desires without considering their impact on anyone else, then been surprised when the consequences proved more complex than anticipated. After he left, I walked through the house slowly, seeing it with new eyes. Soon it would be sold, transformed from my home into someone else's dream, its rooms filled with different furniture and different memories. The thought should have been devastating, but instead I felt something approaching liberation. This house had been beautiful, comfortable, filled with the accumulation of 30 years of marriage. But it had also been a cage of sorts, a symbol of the life I'd built around someone else's expectations and preferences. Selling it would provide the financial foundation for whatever came next, but more importantly, it would free me from the weight of trying to preserve something that had been broken beyond repair. 3 months later, I stood in the driveway of a smaller house across town, watching the moving truck pull away from my new beginning. The Tudor revival on Maple Street had sold for enough to pay off all marital debts and provide both Bartholomew and me with substantial nest eggs for our respective futures. He'd used his portion to buy a modern condo downtown, closer to the office and to Vivian, who'd apparently decided that damaged goods were still better than no goods at all. My new home was a 1920s bungalow with hardwood floors, built-in bookcases, and a garden that needed attention but showed promise. It was entirely mine, purchased with my own funds, decorated according to my own tastes, free from the need to accommodate anyone else's preferences or expectations. Evangeline and Maximilian had taken the divorce better than expected, perhaps because they'd sensed the growing distance between their parents during recent visits. They'd been disappointed, but not surprised, and both had expressed relief that the pretense of marital harmony had finally ended. They'd also made it clear that while they loved their father, they didn't approve of his methods or his choices. As I unpacked boxes in my new kitchen, I found myself thinking about that anniversary dinner that had changed everything. Bartholomew's certainty that he could simply discard me had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of who I was and what I was capable of when pushed to defend myself. He'd seen 30 years of partnership and support as evidence of weakness rather than strength, accommodation as proof of defeat rather than choice. The pearl necklace from our 25th anniversary sat in a jewelry box upstairs, unworn since that night at Le Bernardin. I'd considered selling it, but ultimately decided to keep it as a reminder of something important, that pressure and irritation, when properly handled, could indeed produce something beautiful and valuable. The marriage that had created that necklace was over, but the woman who'd emerged from its destruction was stronger, clearer, and more self-possessed than she'd ever been before. My phone rang as I arranged books on the living room shelves, interrupting my contemplation of new beginnings. Margaret's voice carried the warm efficiency that had made her invaluable during the chaos of recent months. "Mrs. Ashworth," she said, and I smiled at the name that was mine alone now, no longer half of a partnership that had outlived its usefulness. "The Henderson account has requested a meeting about expanding your representation. Apparently, word is getting around about your success in complex property negotiations." Success. The word felt strange applied to the dissolution of my marriage, but I understood what she meant. My handling of the divorce had reminded the legal community that Seraphina Ashworth was a formidable attorney in her own right, not simply the wife of senior partner Bartholomew Ashworth. Clients were beginning to seek me out specifically, drawn by reputation and results rather than family connections. "Schedule it for next week," I said, looking around the living room that was slowly taking shape according to my vision rather than someone else's demands. "And Margaret, I think it's time to discuss opening my own practice. I have some ideas about the kind of law firm I'd like to build." After ending the call, I returned to unpacking, each item finding its place in this new life I was constructing, one careful decision at a time. The afternoon light streamed through windows I'd chosen, illuminating space that belonged entirely to me, free from the weight of disappointment and compromise that had accumulated over 30 years of marriage. Outside, autumn was giving way to winter, but inside my new home, everything felt like spring.